Hello from Muraro and Company Advocates. My name is Brian Onyango, an associate in the Dispute Resolution Department, where I specialize in employment and labor disputes, family law and succession, constitutional law, and arbitration. Welcome to OCO Roundtable, and in today's episode, we will be commemorating the International Day of Persons with Disability, which occurs on the 3rd day of December, thanks to a 1992 resolution by the United Nations General Assembly, which set it aside to focus the world's attention on the achievements, challenges, struggles, opportunities, and benefits that are a hallmark of PWD involvement in the activities of daily living. According to the United Nations, the observance of this day aims to promote an understanding of disability issues and therefore mobilize support for the dignity, rights, and well-being of PWDs. This day also seeks to increase awareness on the gains to be derived from the inclusion of PWDs into the various socioeconomic, political, and cultural aspects of life. The day is therefore an opportunity for us to reflect on the experiences of PWDs worldwide, and particularly Kenya. For you and I, it is a chance to ask ourselves what role we play in creating a disability-inclusive space. And that is what we are here to do today, with the help of my two guest experts, that is Samuel Odawo and Joline Owinga, whom we are delighted to host, and they will be helping us today to unpack the theme for this year's International Day for Persons with Disability, which is United in Action to Rescue and Achieve SDGs for, with, and by persons with disabilities. Like I said before, my guests are none other than Samuel Odawo and Joline Owinga. Samuel Odawo is an experienced, diligent, and result-oriented disability inclusion professional with expertise in the area of inclusive education, livelihood, disability programming, disability rights advocacy, disability employment, accessibility, and policy. Samuel holds a master's degree in management of special needs affairs in developing countries from the University of Birmingham in the UK, and a bachelor's degree in education, that is special education and French language, from Kenyatta University. He is currently the CEO of Ulemavu Research Institute, a disability research company, and also a former member of the board of directors of the National Council for Persons with Disability. Samuel has a passion in disability rights empowerment and a vision towards a society where persons with disabilities are independent, productive, and self-reliant. Joline Owinga, on the other hand, holds a Bachelor of Arts degree in business management from the University of Sunderland, an advanced diploma in human resource development from the Institute of Commercial Management, and a diploma in social work, community development, and project planning from the Regional Institute of Africa. Joline currently serves as the Executive Director of Spina Bifida and Encephalocells Trust. She also consults on disability rights and empowerment. Joline has previously worked with Goal Island, Kenya, as a skills trainer of vulnerable children and youth living in the streets and informal settlements within Nairobi. She boasts over 15-year experience and is passionate about promoting the human rights of PWDs, women, and children. Her vision is to attain a just, inclusive, equitable, and sustainable society. Welcome, Samuel and Joline.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So maybe if we can begin with Joline. Joline, United in Action to Rescue and Achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, for, with, and by PWDs. Sounds like a mobilization to counter the insurgency against the SDGs. What, in your view, informs this theme? Who is the world called upon to stop from apparently putting off the purpose of the SDGs?
Wow. Thank you, Brian. Reading the theme for this year, we've had themes since this day was set aside for persons with disability, the 3rd of December every year. The theme calls to question, who are we being rescued from and what do we want to achieve? Yes, of course, we want to achieve the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals for persons with disability, with persons with disability, and by persons with disability. I am keen on for, with, and by, because it simply means there's something good for persons with disability. It means it has to be done together with persons with disability, and also it has to be done by the persons with disability. In other words, leaving no one behind. We are talking about inclusion. We are talking about participation, involvement of persons with disability at all levels. The only issue would be the world has noticed that persons with disability are under siege for some sort and needs to be rescued. Again, we are united to rescue the persons with disability. The word rescue means, in a layman's language, there's a problem somewhere and somebody has to be rescued. For example, we have crisis of floods right now and we are rescuing people from certain parts of the country from the floods. So then we have the issue we want to achieve, this is a sustainable development goal together with persons with disability, therefore not leaving people with disability behind. So my only interest and question would be, who is this person we are being rescued from? And from my point of view, we are being rescued from somebody who is stronger than us, somebody who needs to make decisions, somebody who needs to change certain things and is not changing. So who is the person who is doing the rescue? Is it the stakeholders? Is it the persons with disability? Is it the organizations for persons with disability? I don't know if I'm addressing your question, but I'm just looking at the theme as it is and calling us to think broadly and strategically towards the theme for this year.
Thank you so much, Joline. Indeed, you are addressing my question. And on that point of someone stronger than us, I understand that the Sustainable Development Goals resulted from discussions that involved countries. Who can be stronger than the person or parties that were involved in coming up with this SDG? Perhaps Samuel can help us understand why we need rescue, and who, if you can help us identify the person that is actually the reason why we need rescue of the SDGs. Where is the threat against the Sustainable Development Goals, Samuel?
Thank you, Brian, and it's an honor to be here today. First, allow me to mention that two things are important. One, the SDGs has as its running cornerstone or theme, leaving no one behind and reaching the farthest behind first. Two, the Sustainable Development Goals bind all countries that have signed up to this initiative, the Agenda 2030. And three is that this came as a result of discussions that started from 2012. Towards the end of the Millennium Development Goals, there was a need to have a new set of aspirations, agenda to guide the global community on addressing the critical issues that was seen as facing the world. Now, if you look at this theme, there is United in Action. So that's a rallying call for collective effort to rescue and achieve the Sustainable Development Goals for, with, and by persons with disabilities. Why rescue is being used here, in my view, is because there is some level of tardiness, slowness, inaction in some quarters towards achieving the development goal. And particularly so in relation to the marginalized groups. 2030 is the decade for the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. This is 2023. We only left with 7 years to the lapse of the decade. If you look at action that is being taken by various state parties, it is not commensurate to their commitment. In most cases, when there are budgetary crises, the first people or the first group that gets affected are the marginalized group. We all know what happened during the COVID-19 pandemic. The most vulnerable groups were actually in big trouble because their problems were exacerbated by the pandemic. And therefore, it is common feeling across the sector, the United Nations systems perhaps, that there is need to reinvigorate the efforts by various stakeholders. So that would involve the state parties, that would involve the private sector, the development agencies, the organizations of persons with disabilities, the charitable organizations, and every person in the global community to ensure that there is some reinvigoration of efforts and rejuvenation of resolve to actually work towards achieving these sustainable development goals. Otherwise, they just come across as just some other aspirations that were said and not implemented. So that's how I look at it.
Yeah, thank you so much, Samuel. And when you talk about the efforts by states and not living up to the commitment of the SDGs, that alone in itself, it is an indictment on the goodwill of the state. And when you look at the theme, the language and the tone generally seem to suggest little or no progress in the involvement of PWDs on development causes, for example. We are talking here about more than a decade since the birth of the SDGs at a UN conference, I think in Rio. Does this imply a reality to the effect that SDGs are in fact unsustainable insofar as disability inclusion is concerned? Samuel?
Well, not to the extent that they are unsustainable, perhaps, but rather to the extent that the conscience need to be reawakened. There could be goodwill, but little action to demonstrate such goodwill. Maybe the goodwill is on paper. And I think that is why this is coming up. And not just some action, but that action need to be appropriate, and that has to be done, with the involvement of persons with disabilities. So you're not just doing it for persons with disabilities. You got to do it with their involvement, and they will got to be part of the plan, part of the action. I think that is something that is quite coming through from this theme. And also, most importantly, is that we got to work collectively. I know many things are being done by different sectors, but sometimes it could be that they are being done single-handedly in silos. And so the need then to rally stakeholders to work collectively towards the same goal.
Maybe the reason we are experiencing slow progress is probably because of an apparent misunderstanding in terms of disability mainstreaming and sustainable development goals. Perhaps, Joline, you can help us understand disability inclusion in the context of SDGs, because we could perhaps be overstretching the objectives of the SDGs to areas not adequately contemplated at the time of making these goals. How are we to understand disability inclusion vis-a-vis the Sustainable Development Goals? What is disability inclusion in that sense?
Thank you, Brian. If I would take us back to what Sustainable Development Goals aim to achieve, in a nutshell, it says to transform our world. Our world. It is a call to action to end poverty, inequalities, to protect the planet, ensure that all people enjoy justice, health, and prosperity. In the SDGs, the 17 of them, we find 52 disability-related indicators in the SDGs, within which 17 mention the word disability, vulnerability, disadvantaged groups in the indicators, and 15 mention in their targets or in the metadata, and 20 indicators are identified by stakeholders as disability-related. So it means SDGs is considerate, is purposeful towards ensuring that all people enjoy health, justice, and prosperity. So we cannot isolate the SDGs and disability mainstreaming. It has to go hand in hand. And in my view, we cannot achieve the Sustainable Development Goals in the next 7 years without inclusion of persons with disability. And not just inclusion, it has to be strategic, it has to be intentional, and it has to be consistent. It is estimated that about 1 billion people in the world have some form of disability. That is 10% of the world's population. And therefore, it brings me closer home. That means out of the 55 plus million Kenyans, 10% have some form of disability. We cannot wish away 10% because right now, if the 10% we are talking about is true, according to World Health Organization, it means we cannot just plan things that are not inclusive for that category of persons. So in my view, we cannot achieve the sustainable development goals without including persons with disabilities.
But I'm concerned, Joline, that we are talking about the need to include persons with disabilities in order to have proper attainment of the sustainable development goals in the next 7 years, which is the estimated period by which some of the goals are, estimated to have been achieved. We are talking in 2023, some 10 or so years after these goals were born. And we are talking now about 7 years within which to include persons with disabilities. Why are we now speaking about 7 years, yet there is a whole 10 years within which persons with disabilities had an opportunity to raise their voices on this issue?
I would say we were not strategic, we were not intentional, we were not consistent. In our context, disability, as my colleague Sam has said, is always one of the sectors that receive a lashback, little attention, and when there needs to be a reduction in budget, we target disability. It means our attitude towards disability mainstreaming is still not up to the task, so that we are always focusing on budget cuts towards disability as non-essential part of the development in the country. So I think it has to do with our attitude. It has to do with our being strategic and intentional in what the SDG intended to achieve with regards to persons with disability. And I'm sure the people who came up with this theme must have looked at the indicators and noticed there's a gap in disability mainstreaming with regards to attainment of the SDGs. And that's why it is strategic, and it has been brought to the forefront that we must address this issue going forward to attain the SDGs. This theme has come from somewhere. It has been a realization of a big gap that has been there over 10 years. And so they are trying to bridge this gap within the 7 remaining years. And it is a call to action to all of us to actually help support and bridge the gap and get disability issues at the same level where the other issues are.
Yeah, maybe I could get Samuel's perspective on this. Do you think it is possible for us to achieve anything different in the next 7 years, something we could not achieve in the last 10 years? Is it possible? And maybe in answering that, you may want to consider the specific goals that are of very particular relevance, which when we decide to come up with a strategy that will ensure that we achieve this agenda by 2030, those specific goals will be integral.
I would say that your question has got no definite answer in terms of a yes or no. But what I can say is, yes, it is possible to achieve something significant. As to whether we will achieve the aspirations as espoused in the SDGs, that would be a matter of conjecture. What I would say is, if, for instance, we achieved SDG number 4 on education, inclusive education for persons with disabilities, a child who gets to school next year, grade 1, would be in junior secondary by 2030. Okay. So that child who's been hidden at home by the parent for fear of stigma by the society, if that child can access school and remain in school, they'll be in junior secondary school in Kenya. If somebody gets employment next year, again, goal number 8, decent work for all. If a person with disability who is qualified and who gets a job will have changed their life significantly, because then they'll be married and they'll be possibly having children, or maybe even have bought a house by mortgage. If you look at goal number 11 on accessible cities and human settlement, again, if we improve access to our cities and to the human settlement, we increase the possibility of persons with disabilities to engage in gainful income or employment. And with that, of course, we know the ripple effects, not just in the economy of that individual, but even in the macro economy, because then the GDP goes high because we have more people contributing towards the cake. And lastly, on goal 17 on data collection, if we have clear data on who these people are, the numbers of these persons with disabilities, I am seeing a situation where we are able to better plan for them. Because when we get to the issues of maybe the status of where we are in the country, there is a lot of interest in disability matters these days. As you know, I run a consultancy firm and I see the interest, but sometimes that interest is kind of impeded by the lack of a planning document. So you don't have a policy, you don't have a plan. How are you going to access the money? You know, the issues of the budget, control of budget. There has to be some accompanying documentation before you can say, oh, I'm withdrawing this money for this purpose. You got to have planned for it. For them to have planned for it, they need clear data. You go to most of these counties, you ask them, how many persons with disabilities are in this county? They don't know. So if goal 17 is at least just scratched on the surface, even if it is not achieved fully, that in itself will have a tremendous effect on then the planning for the needs of persons with disabilities. And I think it is true. Yes, we may not be able to achieve all these goals as set out in the SDGs, in the entire document, but we got to, when we heed the call as put in this theme for this year, United in Action, to rescue and achieve the Sustainable Development Goals for, with, and by persons with disabilities, we will see a great improvement in the living conditions of persons with disabilities, not only in Kenya, but across the globe. So what I say rings true for every other country, particularly those of a low and middle income economy.
As the clock is ticking, we will end our episode here with Joline and Samuel sharing their insights on the underlying concerns related to SDGs that possibly inspired this year's theme for the International Day for Persons with Disabilities. However, our discussion will still continue in the next episode with our guests Joline and Samuel. We will be looking at disabilities and SDG in the context of Kenya. In the meantime, we would like to thank you, our listeners, for taking the time to join us for this episode. We hope you found our discussions to be enlightening, and we invite you to listen to more of these and other topics by subscribing to our podcast. We value your feedback, and you can also share your feedback by reaching out to us through our social media channels using the hashtag OCO Roundtable. Until then, goodbye and take care.